Welcome, everybody. I'm Will McPhee, System Support, CEO of System Support. And today, we've had a lot of webinars about, cybersecurity, about, we've done the ghost stories. AI has been a very fun, hot topic, but I want to kind of go back to fundamentals of how you take process and even if having something regardless of the technology that you use, like this could be done on paper, this could be done in 1,000 different programs, but to kind of limit the scope, say, hey, chances are a lot of folks have Microsoft 365 already, and in using the Microsoft 365 platform, how do you handle the life cycle of work for client data that kind of starts the something comes in and then it goes all the way to its archive of that final handling of data well at the end. And the fundamentals, while they are pretty boring, pretty dry, now is the time to really revisit it because the if with a lot of the AI tools that are coming, or for actually rather here, having a clear infrastructure will make it so that the day comes that you want to implement an AI agent or some type of better dashboard, that is already the infrastructure is there to do it rather than having things scattered. The way to think about it is effectively having the firm set up in such a way that having the firm set up in such a way that you can effectively hire infinite people through AI tools. Yeah, well, not infinite. At least imagine you could suddenly scale up 5 to 10 employees via agents. But the key is making sure that things are set up correctly for who owns what is the process, having it move through appropriately to get to the point that you're not sitting there fighting trying to get an agent certain data. At an overarching level, I think what's important to remember is that if you were to really grow the firm and grow a lot of what you're doing, data can't live in places that are siloed. It can't live in the bulk of the client communication lives in a single person's mailbox. The bulk of client data lives in a personal OneDrive with some stuff living in Dropbox. Having data organized, set up, labeled specific ways makes it so that, AI or a virtual assistant would be able to step in cleanly and be able to do the work. So as we think about that, the real everyday reality that a lot of firms have is that information isn't really missing. It's just scattered across a bunch of different silos. It has unofficial homes. There are half-made decisions that, what people should be doing is spread between a text message, a email exchange, maybe a Teams chat, and that it's really difficult to kind of look at one thing to say, hey, what's going on? So sticking with a lot of the Microsoft 365 files will live in one person's email and then another person's OneDrive and then a SharePoint site. And then some decisions are made in Teams. And then there's some things that just live on somebody's desktop or a USB drive that nobody ever, added to an official repository. So, it just becomes really scattered. Final versions of certain documents or working documents are hard to identify. I know I've had this a lot too with, we are working on a service manual internally for listing out what it is that we do. And, on our end, as we were editing it, we were trying to set up an appropriate repository with the attorney for making sure that we'd move through this iterative document because it started at 65 pages and we got it down to 24 of a giant bullet point list of everything that system support does. But, final version 26 is not really a good title system for, degree of edits. The other big thing we see too for, not trying to find final versions is former employees will still have a lot of key folders. We've seen this with, somebody leaves and it turns out they were the ones that had the Microsoft forms and all their responses are going to somebody who's no longer there, or former employee's account keeps getting turned over for a new person over and over again. So some of that organization of who owns what doesn't move cleanly, and that the system now depends on a key person more than it depends on a structure of how information is handled. And then the other one that has really poor visibility, which can really cause some serious problems, is looking at external sharing links that may have indefinite sharing, and anybody with the link is able to access it. So private documents could be hanging out there that anybody with a link would be able to view and see what's in there. And if you're trying to spread this across Dropbox and a whole bunch of other places, is there a process for reviewing that external sharing or having any form of alerting that, hey, following external share has been kicked off? So, the everyday messy reality, things are all over the place. And in nothing wrong with it, but it's one of those, you need a solid foundation for being able to grow it. And, overwhelmingly today, especially too at a high level, this isn't a technical product demo. I'm not trying to dive into the guts of 365. I'm going to try and keep this moving as fast as I can and not turn it into IT 504 from the University Will, and going to do my best to leave my Dr. Doom mask aside for any type of compliance scares. This is more just hammering on fundamentals of good process to make sure that, yeah, you have good hygiene, good infrastructure to grow the way you want to. So let's start at that client data life cycle. So, if you're stumbling off the starting blocks and that life cycle is unclear, the mess starts early and just propagates all the way through. It's the kind of the butterfly effect, right? The butterfly effect is not necessarily that a butterfly flaps its wings and causes a hurricane. The issue is that a butterfly flaps its wings, the model doesn't account for it, and the model is so wrong at the end of it that it missed the hurricane. But for this client lifecycle, what I'm looking at here is just going to be specifically within Microsoft 365. So that way I don't have to keep repeating different terms for this is Google Workspace, this is Clio, this is etc. So if we look at that client data lifecycle, it really kicks off with the intake. Something is coming in. Now, there is a checklist. As a matter of fact, call right I had before this was an inbound lead qualification checklist. Thank you, Zoom, for blurring the information. And there are certain things that, I do it on pen and paper while I'm on the call so that I'm not looking at my computer screen, because God help me if a Teams notification or a text message comes through. So I do it on pen and paper, and then I punch it into the CRM, kind of kicking it off. So you want to make sure that you have an intake, something's coming in, and you're getting the same information every time. Triage it. Where does it need to go? Who owns this? Oh, this is a blank request. This needs to go to the blank person. This is a real estate. This is a litigation. This is, etc. What category does this fall under for typically what our known inbound pieces are? What workspace is it going into? Does this need to be in, hey, is there a certain folder of where these documents need to, hey, kick it off with, here's the first piece. This is the first draft, copy the template. This is the client folder. Moving into then the active work. Are you doing the work, making sure the file is there? Maybe there's a key trip or maybe a medical event comes off. You need to hand it off. Folks know where to go. Hey, where's the Jones file for their purchase and sale? That's right there. It's labeled. Think we know where it is. Obviously, as you're working on something for somebody, it eventually has to make it out to them. So how do you extend it for collaboration, but you know who does what, and you make sure that only those that you intended are able to work on it? Close out the file. Things are done. Purchase and sale is done. Everybody's happy. Close it out. You set the retention based on what the requirements are for how long do you have to hang on to a copy of this thing, because the digital world, while you can store a lot of information, it's just like the real world where your office can only hold so much paper and your filing cabinets can only hold so much paper. So at a certain point, it has to move from one part to another in the building. And then that final archive and disposition, at what point do you not have to hang on to it? Or, yeah, you keep a backup of it and lives in the proverbial basement of the digital office. So looking at intake, I'm sure we can all commiserate with this problem. Intake is a vague process, and again, it's that butterfly effect of one problem at the beginning can really set the stage for bigger problems down the road. And as we all know, information arrives through a ton of channels. I'm guilty of this as well. I know I have, for some of the folks on the call, I have texted them for certain requests. And so it could be difficult if, a text message comes in that doesn't have enough information, then it turns into an email. So And as we think about all the different ways information comes into us, an email, a Teams chat, a text message, a phone call, it can be difficult to get it all to funnel into one place for intake. And then especially too, there's no clear work trigger that says, right, is this just kind of a one-off question? Like, I really need to do something here. Is this just a little piece of advice that I have to hand out? What then turns into saying, hey, nope, all right, I do have to draft something. There's going to be a specific workspace for this specific type of work, and we're going to put that there. And, what is the clear trigger points that you have to answer for it? What sensitive data might be coming in before you start defining some protection rules? I mean, nothing prevents somebody from going cowboy and texting you their social security number, but you really don't want to have those type of things just hanging out there, because that can become real problematic real quick. So how do you kick off rules that say, hey, this is going to contain a bank account information, social security number, etc. How do I know which rules are going to apply here and what my limits on sharing and things are? And just that first document will usually, that first thing that comes in, that first inbound, if that's set correctly and you have that good starting checklist, it kind of follows from there. Can't help myself for at least bringing a little bit of the AI pieces in here. Creating checklists is difficult. Yeah, I am not going to, and especially to most of us are way too busy as well for sitting down and typing out checklists. I mean, a great example here, going back to this blurred one, this is double-sided, and this is just for a 15-minute phone call for folks that are coming in, for making sure that, I get the answers for what, getting the answers to make sure that the process is done at the intake, that, hey, we're not getting a wrong fit client or something like that. And being perfectly honest, I used AI to develop it based on here are use some best practices, use this book, use this expert, make this. I looked it over and I said, no, that's good enough for me to get started. And for a lot of these process points, when you get stuck on something, you can use the AI tools to prompt against it to say, hey, help me develop this checklist. And, and even if you don't know what questions you should be asked to develop that intake checklist, you can say, I don't know what questions you should ask me for making an intake list. And that really nice part with an AI is because of its overwhelming need to please, it won't say that something's a stupid question. So I really like being able to ask it questions and being able to quote unquote look like an idiot, and then it just doesn't judge me. So it's a good space. So looking at some of these better intake decisions, have it a policy before it's really a workflow. You know the why and how it should be done rather than okay, these are the mechanics to it. So, who owns it? Is it the principal? Should it be a paralegal? Should it be a mix? Is there, does the person who does own intake have the visibility into all the appropriate channels? Is there, a great example is like for us here, text messages are, we'll get text message requests a bunch, and making sure, hey, who owns that intake for those text messages? What type of minimum information is required, for again, to that checklist based on, what your firm does, what are at least the minimums you have to have. And if you ask the AI to make the checklist, look over it real quick. And then if you go, hey, what about, just add it. Make sure to quickly highlight which data is sensitive. That's an easy one. We all know which type of data is spicy. The ones we find overwhelmingly is XXX-XX-XXXX, good old social security numbers. Where does the first firm-owned record get created? Is this okay, we got the request from Rockland Trust for doing a HELOC review, for doing a HELOC. Is it is that first record created in a SharePoint site? Is it in like a public repository? It's one of those that if this gets created, where does it go? And then who approves access to some of those? Is your front office folks empowered to be able to give external access to your clients? Or is that something that you need to say, nope, only the principal or a partner is allowed to say, yeah, you can share that with client XYZ or, client XYZ's representative or whatever. So for just a quick overview for some of the tools that are available to you, again, staying Microsoft 365 specific, Microsoft Forms can have that standard intake. So if you don't want to fill out the checklist, Microsoft can make it so that client can fill it out, which is really nice. And it's just a link. Think SurveyMonkey, but internal to yourself. There's also bookings. So if you've ever seen Appointment Core or Calendly or any of those, like, hey, find time with me, rather than emailing back and forth until one of us passes away, you can use bookings for setting those consultations and then setting rules and policies of like, hey, I only want one of those a day, because if I do 8 of these a day, I'm going to go insane. You've got Exchange and Outlook for controlling your intake. You've got SharePoint lists for those intake registers. Power Automate for being able to route things and get notifications. And then sensitivity labels, DLP stands for data loss prevention, and message encryption for making sure certain sensitive things are tagged appropriately and that they can only be stored in certain places. Now, the good news for a lot of these 365 tools that you might have already is you might be staring at all 6 of these and going, I have no idea what half of these are, but I know that I want to make sure that for a purchase and sale agreement for a home, that I need the following information every time. And I want to make a Microsoft form, and you go to the Microsoft form page and you're struggling. Well, AI to the rescue. You just tell it, I'm in Microsoft Forms. I need to create a form that does the following things. Help. It'll help you. It'll give you pretty clear instructions. And if you get stuck, tell it you get stuck. It doesn't get frustrated with you. Hey, I need help, Power Automate, to make sure that I get notified anytime a new email comes in with, following words or something. You can set that up. Just help you can do for making sure that maybe emails with certain trigger phrases get forwarded to the right person for intake. There's all sorts of ways that as those channels are coming in, if you know the keywords and phrases, they can go to the appropriate owners to get it done. And where once all of this had to be handed off to consultants like myself, the world is now in such a place that you can use AI tools to be able to, get things moving along. I realized I should have highlighted those as I talked through them. Although one that I do not recommend using the AI portions for, as a quick aside, are those data loss prevention labels. DLP can get very hairy very quickly, and setting sensitivity labels has to happen in multiple places. And you also want to be careful that on the notifications, because let's say maybe one of your folders has a lot of the fun stuff. See the previous 9 number thing that I said earlier for Social Security numbers. You do not want to have it all of a sudden blow up that all these things are getting labeled as sensitive. Or another fun one that I see is saying, hey, incoming emails getting warned for containing credit card information or bank account information. Sometimes the DLP rules will miraculously interpret phone numbers or certain license numbers that maybe a mortgage broker has, and will flag that and say, hey, this email now has to be like protected, and it could really make a lot of noise and will do more harm than it actually does good. So the sensitivity labels one, do talk to an expert for. But for a lot of the, hey, learn how to help me set up bookings, help me do Microsoft Forms, the AI tools can be overwhelmingly powerful and can coach you through setting it up exactly how you want. And it doesn't cost you more than $20 a month. So really shouldn't, I know that's what we used to do for a lot of, for system support. But I mean, the good news is you can always call us in at the end. But it's
Yeah. Sometimes these tools are like get you 80% of the way there, and then you just need over the finish line.
exactly. So it's then for us, just understanding how we have to roll with the punches for how things are changing. Now, this one, at least from the IT side, is the biggest beef that I have with a lot of law offices. That email is not a filing system. I will say it again. Email is not a filing system. But in an uncomfortable number of firms, it still behaves like one. And the overwhelming evidence that we get is that a standard Microsoft mailbox is 50 gigabytes. That's a lot of space. 50 gigabytes is a lot of data. And I will continuously get from a lot of principals that I need a bigger mailbox. I'm out of space and I can't archive anything. And I need to double it to 100 gigabytes. And that is overwhelmingly because it appears to be treated as the primary filing system. You open up the Outlook and there's a billion folders, there's searching things, there's attachments, there's notes to self. Outlook becomes the workspace. And it is convenient because technically Outlook is a little single pane of glass, and overwhelmingly, email is your workflow. But what happens is that the matters of convenience become these unofficial repository, and that again hits that intake becomes the problem. That it needs to go someplace and is owned by somebody rather than it's living in these silos that might be difficult for someone else to be able to see. Another one we see too is there might be folks are sharing collaboration documents in a OneDrive, so then, folks are having difficulty getting access to the different data, or, maybe somebody wants to work from home, paralegals in an office, or the attorney is traveling all over the place and it becomes difficult to get files in different places. That keeping things in the appropriate workspace of saying like, all right, we're doing SharePoint sites. The SharePoint sites have client folders. Client folders have this. Setting that at the beginning of making sure things move it out is a good start. I see this internally a lot, but not necessarily just because I've not seen a lot of legal firms take up on Teams, but sometimes you see Teams chats can hold key decisions that could easily extend to something like a text message holds a key decision. It's just not captured in the appropriate channel, so that, maybe there's some context lost when somebody's trying to help with cleaning something up. And then a SharePoint site was set up by the IT company at one point, and I see it there, but I'm not 100% sure what it's supposed to hold. There's some documents in it, but I don't know what this is. But, they're just, as you can see, people kind of will set their workbench up for what they need, and it makes it so that things don't flow from, key person to key person appropriately. So with a workspace model, those unofficial systems get created, but you should have something that when you look at it, who owns it, how it's structured, and who has access to it is really obvious. Hey, the firm owns a SharePoint site, library, or a Teams connected workspace. Teams is nice because you can chat back and forth and attach files to it. That's how Ryan and I organize these things and go through all the documents. These all live in a single Teams channel so that it doesn't get crossed in with the different emails and all the other questions that I have. And then, things are organized in those shared Teams folders of, hey, these are webinars, these are mailing campaigns, this is the overall KPI tracking, etc. Folders should have very similar names. It should not be, hey, webinar names are not May, blah, blah, blah webinar. Hey, it's 2026-05 May, 2026-04 April. Presentations are named the title of the talk and what it's about. Good enough business system organization, or what's on your bench, basic AI dashboard building. So that, what was that presentation I gave? It's very easy to go back and figure out what it was that we had. Named owners, whose folder is owned by who. So, hey, that folder is so-and-so's responsibility. Is there a quick way to be able to label that? And, if I have a question about the Jones family, do I know exactly who to talk to without having to use a whole bunch of tribal knowledge to be able to do that? Granted, a lot of firms have that tribal knowledge already to understand who they need to go talk to when they have a question about a certain client. But how would an AI agent have that same insight? Great example for me today is, I was doing a financial review because it's the end of the month, and I'm looking at the Microsoft 365 bills, and I'm trying to figure out what's going on there. And I notice in the Microsoft 365 bills that something's not right. So I gave the invoice that I got from my vendor and the report out of my QuickBooks, and I gave it to ChatGPT and said, figure out what's going on here. Why am I paying the vendor more than I'm invoicing? And it spat out a bunch of information, but there's a lot of context missing on certain clients that says, hey, this wasn't billed. Hey, this wasn't billed. And turns out it was just under a different name. So it goes to that concept of making sure things are labeled and have named owners appropriately. You also want to set default permissions for each folder. It shouldn't be a question of who can edit, who can download, who can view. Now, a small firm, you can keep it pretty wide open, but maybe you want some appropriate separation, that there are some private documents that, hey, this is just for the firm owners or partners, that any of the staff shouldn't be able to see. That needs to live in a very specific folder with very specific permissions versus, hey, client folders always have the following readout of, no external sharing, none of this, none of this. External sharing has to go to a separate repository, etc. Versioning, this is a big one. So the good news is if you keep it in OneDrive and SharePoint, versioning is applied automatically. You should see a little autosave button kicked on in the upper left-hand corner. I know some folks hate the autosave feature because they think it will mess certain things up, but versioning is really important. It allows you to go back and see, okay, I made these changes and who made these changes, especially if you're in Microsoft 365 with the subscription. Whoever is editing the document, their name is going to come up as to when they made edits. And this actually came in handy at another firm because they were asking who deleted all this data, and I came back and said, well, it looked like it was you based on the following information at 2:36 p.m. on May 11th. So it's a fun one. And then just setting a clear rule for final documents. Is there a specific folder they need to go in? Is there a specific naming convention that just, beyond a reasonable doubt, that is the final version of whatever it is that you're working. So I have a really rough suggested workspace template. You could have a giant clients folder. Client is organized in the following name, and then under it, it's engagement letter, client stuff the client sent you, work product you're making, correspondence back and forth, final delivered, billing questions, and then anything that needs to be archived after a certain point for, hey, this isn't inactive and I don't need to see it in the following folders here. It's a good starting template if not wondering where to get started. And then this is this is a professional presentation. Otherwise, I would have put the meme in of the Spider-Man pointing at each other of, those shared workspaces will fail when everyone assumes that someone else owns a certain decision. You have to have appropriate decision sets of like, all right, who is making this decision about the following piece? Who is defined as business owner? Who owns the backups? Who approves access? Now, it's okay if one person wears multiple hats. I understand this isn't, there's not a lot of 5,000 person law firms out there, and it might be 2 attorneys and a paralegal or 2, but, still good to say, hey, this person is the external approver. Maybe there's some policy guys that just say, yep, things can always be shared to the client email address on file for correspondence for whatever. And if the aunt of whoever is trying to do this wants access, they have to talk to Bob in order to say, yep, they're allowed to get access to the following information. Who has the final say on saying a file is closed out? Who is making the determination of how long a certain document needs to be kept? Is it a 1 year? Is it a 3 year, 5, 7, 10, infinite? And then just setting a review date too, to say, these are the folks that have the following roles. Is there any changes to these policies? Do this out of the office. Maybe set it at a nice place when the weather's nice like today, go golfing afterwards, something like that. But sometimes taking that step back to look at those roles and responsibilities is worth its weight in gold. And that's a tough one too, to offboard AI, because you could say, hey, what are the roles and responsibilities for that person? It's easy to make the one pager for the roles, but who actually owns it, and then how are they enforcing it as a horse of a different color? And then as we think of the active work and so moving on from the workspace to the actual active work, as we think of the different active work risks, you can have security, you can have convenience, but you cannot have both. So now you can make things simple in the security portion, but there will be some friction in certain pieces. So, convenience can create this exposure if you just don't have clear rules. So a lot of the day-to-day ones that we see is, access sprawl. Too many people can see too much, can get into too many folders, see too many passwords, etc. The information is across a variety of devices. There's random cell phones, random laptops, personal laptops, home computers. So it's very difficult to rein in where the information actually lives. And then, multiple local copies, that is very difficult to nail down. Hey, where is the final version of this purchase and sale agreement? Why is the client asking me questions about this? This is when I sent them. So for access for who should see what, it's not necessarily about turning it into forks and knocks, but just saying, hey, based on the responsibility someone has, how much can they see? Can they view it? Can they read it? Are they allowed to edit it? Can they download it and take it somewhere else? So use role-based where possible, rather than saying this is Jeannie's roles and this is Mary's roles. Just say, we're making a position senior paralegal, and a senior paralegal is empowered to do the following. Again, moving from where there was a lot of personality and long-standing employees in a lot of scenarios, as the AI agent pieces become more prolific, using that role-based makes it easier for those agents to adopt those permissions and move with it quickly. And you're not giving the agent, because it will move a lot faster than you are able to catch it, it will give it the appropriate guardrails that it's not seeing things that it's not supposed to. And even worse, seeing something it's not supposed to and then relaying that to a client, because while that might not be the reality now, might not be the reality next year, it almost certainly will be in the next 3 years. So again, avoid direct individual permissions unless strictly necessary, and if strictly necessary, put it in writing somewhere. Have a hard wall between the internal content and the client shareable. Think of it as the locked filing cabinet versus the reading room that clients can walk into. And then just make sure you make a conscious effort of reviewing that access at intake, staffing changes. Now, staffing changes can be pretty emotional, but making sure that, hey, part of the process of a termination is that there's an access review of, hey, this person had the access to the following. How's this done? Yeah, you don't want somebody leaving and all of a sudden turns out they held some keys to the kingdom, or even worse, you don't shut off their access after they leave. So please, just from a humble IT firm, please tell us when somebody's leaving. It helps us a lot. And then especially too is what devices can someone access the data from? Can they get it on any device via a web page? Are you using some form of mobile device management for a firm-owned device? Are you giving out phones, iPads, etc.? Are you doing mobile application management for saying, hey, if somebody tries to use a personal cell phone and access OneDrive or their email, we want to have the ability that maybe I can't wipe their whole phone, but I can nuke their Outlook profile remotely if, I don't know, God forbid, I'm going to pick on Nolan. Nolan goes crazy. I can remove his email from his phone. Yeah,
Or
also,
even someone's phone gets lost or stolen.
yeah, especially since yours truly decided to leave his wallet at Panera last night, had to go get it this morning. So we'll have the credit monitoring bureaus are going to have fun with that one to see if anybody tagged my stuff while I was gone. So this will be fun. And then, defining whether unmanaged devices can access firm data. And that one, again, since this isn't a compliance scare piece, you just need to be reasonable here. We all have, there's maybe a firm-owned laptop. You go on travel. The critical call comes in that says, oh my God, I need this document right now. I need something right now. And you need to go on your better half's computer to get something done. And you want to make sure that you could just, if you get into the web page, you use in 365, you use your email, you use your password, you go through the multi-factor authentication, and you're in that web browser, and then you sign out when you're done. Hey, I'm okay with accepting a degree of that risk of being able to access it from a web page because life happens, and in those critical moments, I just need access, and I'm going to put my faith in the protections that are there. Say, all right, I'm good to go for, accessing from an unmanaged device. And then another big one too, assuming that you have Microsoft Business Premium, using Microsoft Intune for being able to get those computers set up, rolling out of the box without having to really think about it. Now, what kind of IT presentation would I have if I didn't talk a little bit about threat protection? So it's not just where the data is resting and having a good time. It's also of while people are using it. So the big one, phishing emails. I can do everything in my power to make sure that I clean up phishing emails, but that doesn't prevent, maybe your opposing counsel is a real old school attorney and he's using an AOL.com email address that he hasn't changed the password in 35 years. And you have a very interesting purchase and sale coming up, and he sends you, hey, we've got some changes coming in for, here's a new DocuSign. So it comes from somebody you've been talking to, but it turns out because it's an insecure email with a password that hasn't been changed for a long time, an attacker has been sitting in it and waited until this absolutely opportune moment to send you the bait and switch. Most spam filters aren't really going to detect it because it comes from somebody that you trust. It's still a DocuSign link. It just happens to be slightly off enough that redirects somewhere else. So the phishing emails are still there. They still come through, and you have to have the appropriate cybersecurity awareness training and enough of the protections to be able to prevent that account takeover, because it's not really the spray and pray. It's just that somebody that you trust sends that malicious attachment. Could be that creds get stolen in a momentary lapse of reason. You use the same password at Adobe as you did at 365. And because of one of those malicious attachments, a token got stolen for multi-factor. And hey, what do you know? They got into the account. Do you have an ability to detect if somebody's logging in somewhere that they're not supposed to? That's where we come in. Good old ransomware. Now, actually, so the ransomware threat protection for active work, there's this ransomware compromised endpoint one. I actually have a pretty good, yeah. Well, all right, I'll dip my toe in the Dr. Doom portion of. It was a law office here in the South Shore that, they kind of data was organized, but at least on the cybersecurity front, that things were in a lot of different places. And so some folks would work from home and they would connect via VPN to get access to their email and get access to file server, because their email and the files all lived on a server in the basement. And so because these were home computers connecting via a VPN, meaning it was the home computers coming into the office, the home computers were compromised with Lord knows what. And a ransomware gang had figured out this was a real estate attorney shop and that it was a pretty sizable one. So they sat there. They were in there about 100, 120 days, then deployed the ransomware, locked up all the computers in the office, and hit the email, which was where a lot of information about clients was stored, as well as the database and files and folders that they had. So, these folks were just doing their work, but had problems where the ransomware came in because of just not having the appropriate controls for access. There was no multi-factor. They were using a compromised device. So kind of have hey, VPN isn't always the cleanest way to try and connect to something. So moving on from that story too, there's also the external sharing. Where are things leaving the office door? Sharing should be intentional, visible, and reversible. I mean, sure, it's one thing if you just email a draft of a document and you don't care who sees it. Fine. But, it's another thing if you're leaving certain sensitive documents with an external sharing, anyone with a link can access, and you just kind of go from there. So you really need to make sure that there's a form of a, client portal, an ability to, say, is there maybe a third-party software that you can use for building a client portal? Maybe you want to have a dedicated SharePoint site for that client, especially if it's a larger one. Something that's very explicit about who has access to what and what email address it is. Are you collaborating with an outside counsel? Are you going to give the outside counsel a degree of their own 365 login within your tenant? Are you going to have them as a guest under their own email address in there? How do you want to handle that for visibility? For saying, hey, I want to create one for my own, McAfee Law Inc., McAfeeLaw.com. And, when I'm done working with Josh Smith, I just want to turn his account off and I don't have to worry about what firm files he still has access to. Accountants, how do you want to share with the accountants? Is there a specific accounting folder? Is it going to be by client? Is it going to be, hey, just these? Maybe there's some consultants involved for being able to give certain information. And then vendors like ours truly. Hey, how do you watch the fox in the hen house? How do you make sure the IT company that you can watch, how do you watch the watchman? So looking at sharing and where files go should be intentional, visible, and reversible. And the good news is 365 does a good job at that. So a real basic decision sharing tree, external sharing decision tree is really, is the data allowed to leave the firm? What is the recipient able to do with it? Can they take it with them? Effectively, can they take the picture of it and walk with it? Are they only going to have access to this information for 30 days, 90 days, 180, forever? does that file contain any of the spicy stuff, and it should be labeled or encrypted in some way, shape, or form because certain requirements. And then who has the right to remove the access later? Who's that access approver to be able to say, hey, we need to walk that back. So looking at some of those, there's tons of tools in 365. So SharePoint and OneDrive have wonderful sharing controls. So I recommend too, especially if you're doing things externally, keep it in SharePoint. There are a lot of things you can do for guest access rules for setting if they can download, view, edit. You can get pretty granular with it in 365, especially doing things like the link expiration. And then also, there are ways to encrypt email if you are sending like, hey, this file contains, I'm sending this email out. It contains sensitive information. I can apply email encryption so only the recipient can view it. And then with some of the sensitivity labels and DLP warnings, if one of your clients uploads something that has something fun in it, you can get a warning about it. So that comes for the how you're getting the collaboration pieces out of the office. But the good news is a lot of the SharePoint site setups help with it. So moving on to the closeout, now that we're starting to get in the nice twilight time of the life cycle of the work. So things may be moving on, but that data, that piece of paper really hasn't been there unless somebody's really deliberately and intentionally closing that loop. So it may be that on the business side for billing, the invoices in QuickBooks and you're good to go, but Microsoft 365 may just, still just hanging out. Still a lot of external access that's active. There's still a lot of drafts and final versions hanging out in the same folder so that if, after 3 years you have to come back, or maybe you're handing the files off to somebody else, that they sit there and go, I don't have any of the context of how this stuff is set up. Which one's the final? Which is the draft? What is this? Or the other fun one, the departed employees still own important files, and there's a key client folder that's still hanging out someplace that it shouldn't. And then, there's no retention rule applied. Hey, are we hanging on to this for a year, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years? Can we delete it after a certain point where I just say I'm not responsible for this stuff anymore? How long do you have to retain that information in the live data set? So for a basic checklist, hey, final deliverables promised are good. Everything is now moved to final. External sharing's been reviewed. Guests and outside collaborators are removed. This person is the responsible owner. Retention rule is, set to 7 years because it's a tax return problem. And then, hey, this workspace is closed. Hey, this specific matter, it's good to go. We've followed our checklist. So with everything tied up neatly on a bow, now you'll start looking at how long do you, hey, how long do I need to hang on to this thing I'm not actively working, but I know I need to keep copies of. So retentions can help keep it, so retain it, delete it. So saying, hey, yep, this thing doesn't need to be kept. Or, hey, I'm going to hang on to this for XYZ time, and then I'm going to delete it. You can set global policies within Microsoft 365 for saying, hey, writ large, this is, don't delete anything, which is usually a smart one. Better to, keep it and then make a decision about it rather than letting the machines make the decision for you. But then you want to create labels that are specific to what you need. Hey, this falls under the following requirements. So this is a like tax return degree or a purchase and sale degree retention label. And you can apply that at an item level. So a specific document, specific folder. So you can say, hey, that folder, hang on to it for 3 years, starts a timer, and then at 3 years just goes boop. And then the other thing you can do as well is move to archive. So moving it out of active mailbox and moving it into places that gives you a little bit more storage, but it's not as easily accessible, and then still has the appropriate labeling that you can go back and find it. So online archive for Microsoft 365 between OneDrive and the mailbox, really important, really powerful, and is typically set by time frames. So one thing we'll see get confused a fair amount is archive versus backup. So retention is a governance and compliance piece. Like, hey, I am retaining this information that answers the following questions about a client for XYZ period of time, and I have to keep it in order to meet the following law. An archive is data management. That, hey, The archive is a copy of this information. It's not in the active data set. It's not something people are touching every day. It lives in a separate house as to make sure that the workspace, again, it's the documents in the basement. It's not the things that are on the desk actively worked on. Backup is a recovery from deletion, corruption, operational failure, or ransomware. So even though you may be archiving something or applying retention rules, you may still need a backup to say, I fat fingered something and I deleted a client folder and I need it back. Or my employee went nuts, tried to maliciously delete a bunch of folders, and it was a trusted employee, so they had the ability to be able to do that, and I need to get those folders back. Backup is the ability to get back to where you were, not necessarily saying, hey, I've got the following archive and retention policies because it's XYZ type information. So couldn't help myself for throwing that one in there. So Microsoft 365 for a lot of the retention pieces there's a lot going for it, but it's not a panacea. It's not a magic bullet. There's already a lot of identity pieces, device control, email control, endpoint control, data loss prevention for automatically applying tags based on the information in there and setting retention rules. But you still have to make decisions based on your configuration and your advanced rules and make choices around backup, record management, how you're going to handle if there is, God forbid, an e-discovery, how do you do litigation hold? How do you determine who touched what file? And especially for us, if you use Microsoft 365 or Google Workspace and you want to work with us, backup of that cloud system is a requirement because that just means stuff happens. I mean, I've had a firm where the sent email for 2.5 years just disappeared out of their outbox. There was absolutely nothing in the audit trails for the past 90 days. No archive rules had run. Microsoft just lost 2 years of data, but they had a backup. We got it back. We were good to go. There was just no indicators, compromise, no suspicious sign-ins, nothing. Just 2 years of sent data just gone. So that was good for backup for, hey, operational continuance, right? So you still need to make those decisions about how are you going to back up? What are you going to back up? What's the recovery goals? And just saying, hey, what are those retention rules we need to apply? So to kind of summarize really at a high level, the rambling I've had for the past 50 minutes, good systems are really, you make a few, borrowing from Tim Ferriss, what is the lead domino that you knock over that makes one decision that answers 15 other decisions? So 5 that we boiled it down to is when there's a new client matter or engagement, where does that officially begin? Was there a certain phrase, word, thing that in one of the following channels says that was the starting gun? Is there agreed single source of truth? So for us internally, it's the ticketing system. Ticketing system is single source of truth. I do not accept whatever is in my, in email inboxes, although dirty secret for email. Mine's hooked to the ticketing system, so I made it one and the same. Who owns access while the work is active? Do you have that list of who has access to what files, and it's very clear about who has access to it? What is the policy for external sharing? Hey, when I share something, and it can be simple, it doesn't have to have every angle covered. Just start with good enough. And then, hey, what happens when work closes? What is that checklist of us saying, yes, this process is complete and it's going to its final resting place? So I know that was a lot, but I wanted to open it up at this point for any questions that anybody had. And then also for anybody on the call that would just like a free backup assessment too, because for a lot of these, they're internally owned processes, but I'm happy to do at least a backup assessment of saying, hey, yep, this would be a good idea for how you could get your information back quickly. Happy to do that assessment with anybody here. But also too, while a lot of what we talked about today was process and doing it within Microsoft 365 and looking at this structure, again, I want to highlight what I said at the beginning, where this is setting foundation and a framework for how work is done. Because if it's clear policies and rules, if you could snap your fingers with zero cost and hire 15 brilliant Harvard Law interns, and they could come into your firm and start crunching work, would the system be set up in such a way that they could quickly grasp it, understand it, and work within it without having to step out and gather a bunch of tribal knowledge about your clients and your firm? Could they do it? Is the firm set up to be able to do it? And while there is no magic snapping of fingers to hire a whole bunch of Harvard Law interns, there is this thing called AI that effectively is the same thing. I'm not saying turn your AI agents to draft all the following letters and have them send those files to the clients willy-nilly where it, hallucinates case law of things that never happened in the state of Wisconsin. But in the same token, it can save a lot of time, especially since a lot of things are template based. And if the agent is resting on a solid infrastructure foundation, it allows you to just keep the work going, and that you can have a nice balance of the human hires that make the relationship, that go to the networking events, that give the personal touch and the private, solemn, calming presence that the world of law normally has. But for the stuff that nobody likes doing, which is editing documents and fighting with formatting in Microsoft Word, you can have those digital Harvard Law interns handle it. They just need a skeleton to be able to hang on. So any questions from folks who have made it this far? Awesome. Well,
I think it's just a lot of ideas to absorb.
It's a lot. The ones where we hit the fundamentals are always a lot. So always a big one. And I appreciate everybody coming out today, and hope with your mind swimming with a whole bunch of ideas, you get a chance to step out into the sunshine and nice weather and meditate on it.
Yeah, and you can always go back to the replay that'll be sent out.
Yes. Fun facts, turn it into a transcript, take the transcript, turn it into a summary document, take the summary document, turn it into an action item list. AI is a wonderful, wonderful tool for ingesting information. Awesome. Have a fantastic day, everybody.
Bye, everybody.